Hello and welcome to the Everything's Black and White podcast with me, Aaron Stokes. It's a Friday afternoon, and if you're here for the View for the Opposition podcast, I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you. We've got a little bit of a schedule change this week, and we will be looking ahead to Sunday's game with Wolves, but more importantly, we'll be using this podcast to talk a little bit about what Eddie Howe said in his pre-match press conference at Benton on Friday morning, because there's lots to discuss, and as you can imagine, a lot of it is based around Paul Mitchell and his interview that he gave during the international break. So we'll be diving into that. We'll be diving into what Eddie Howe finally had to say about that. This was the first chance we had to speak to the Newcastle boss since Paul Mitchell, the sporting director, spoke to journalists about 10 days ago. And we'll get into that in this episode. As usual, if you're watching on YouTube, please remember to drop us a like and get in the comments section. If you're listening on your podcast provider, please leave us a rating and review, and we'll dive straight into it. Now, I think firstly we need to take a step back. We need to rewind about 9 or 10 days to Paul Mitchell giving what was a very long, wide-ranging and varied interview inside St James's Park to a group of Northeast journalists, as he essentially moved to clarify and set the record straight on what was a really, really tough summer. We obviously, journalists went in there absolutely armed with loads of questions about transfers, about Mark Gahey, about Eddie Howe. But this interview with Paul Mitchell basically lasted 90 minutes, and he was asked a range of questions. Now, just to give you a little flavour, if you haven't heard or seen what he said, he was asked about his reflections on the transfer window, the fact that they didn't bring a first-team starter in. Was it a bad window? Did they miss out on Gahey? Do they need a big sale to balance the books? What is his thoughts about PSR going forward? But there was also a lot of questions about Eddie Howe. Now, this obviously relates even further back to Germany in the summer when Newcastle were on a pre-season trip, and Eddie Howe basically came out and said, look, I'm happy at Newcastle, but this new setup needs to be right for me. Paul Mitchell was asked about those quotes. He was asked about if Newcastle can keep Eddie Howe when England come knocking. Can Newcastle still be number one with this big Saudi investment? And is Eddie Howe happy in the new setup? Now, his response to that question in particular, Paul Mitchell, 9 days ago, was, the last time I saw Eddie, he was pretty happy because we'd just beaten Tottenham at home. He was chuffed to bits. Contrary to opinion, we speak every night more or less, and every day a minimum of once on a range of different topics. I think this idea that me and Eddie haven't spoken all the way through the transfer window is false. All the way right up to the last minute, he is fully updated and involved. Now, that's where we'll start this episode, because Eddie Howe sort of contradicted Paul Mitchell with one of his answers today, where he said he hasn't spoken to Paul Mitchell in the last 9 days since he gave that interview, which goes completely against what Paul Mitchell said when he spoke to the press last week, where he said they were in constant contact. Now, I've seen a lot of people sort of jumping on that fact on social media and really noticing that there was a little bit of a contradiction there. What I will say, maybe to just defend Paul Mitchell on that, is he did also say in that interview that he didn't want to sort of disrupt Eddie Howe's holiday. He wanted him to use the international break to really sort of rest up, and he didn't think he really needed to be updating Eddie Howe as often as he was during the transfer window, now that the window is closed. So I will just defend Paul Mitchell on that. But there was a lot of Eddie Howe's answers today where you think, well, look, if these two men haven't spoken in 9 or 10 days, then you think they probably need to get on the phone call pretty quick, because things are starting to play out at Newcastle. Behind the scenes, they're starting to play out in public, and it's really it's making fans worried. It's making us in the press a little bit anxious as to what's going on. And there's been lots of talk as to whether things are really happy behind the scenes. Now, as I said earlier in this episode a couple of minutes ago, Paul Mitchell's interview last week was, to come out and clarify that him and Eddie Howe are okay, to come out and clarify that everything's working smoothly and seamlessly behind the scenes. And look, we should really be sat here looking ahead to Wolves, talking about Newcastle being unbeaten, the fact that they're getting key men back from injury, the fact that, 10 or 11 of their players had fantastic international breaks for their country. And instead, we're coming to you 2 days before the big game. Everybody's excited for the return of club football. And we're here again talking about more questions than answers. We're talking about, is this relationship really working? And I think Eddie Howe's press conference this morning did nothing to allay any of those fears. And instead, as I say, it probably added more questions than answers for the fan base. Now, one question in particular, caught my eye, and it, there's a big buzzword in there that will have a lot of people talking, and that is the word civil war. Now, that obviously relates to the fact that there's maybe some war and factions in between the boardroom at St James's Park. Is Eddie Howe, Paul Mitchell, Darren Eales, and the Saudis all on the same page? Now, some people took from Paul Mitchell's interview that they were on the same page. I was one of those people. Paul Mitchell came and spoke very highly of Eddie Howe. He spoke about the 5-year project. He spoke about the long-term plans, the excitement for the future. But because this interview was so long and so wide-ranging, I think you can take it a lot of ways. Some people came out and think, well, I picked out this answer and maybe it isn't okay. And some people were jumping on other answers and saying, oh, but look, Paul Mitchell said this and now everything's going okay. Eddie Howe was asked about, whether there was a civil war at Newcastle. And as I've just mentioned, they're unbeaten. They've had a good start to the season despite not playing very well. And yet this is still the question that's dominating the press conference. Now, Eddie Howe's response to that question was, the civil war stuff, absolutely not in my experience. But I am cocooned in my work and absolutely focused on the players and the training. I know you might be bored of that answer, but that is what I do every single day that I'm here. Now, look, Eddie, I'll apologise if I'm wrong, but that does seem like a little bit of a thinly veiled dig. Eddie Howe, the last couple of weeks, it has been very noticeable. He's tried to make it subtle, but it's been noticeable that he keeps saying, look, in this new setup, I am here to coach the players and get results on the pitch. I have very little say now in matters that I used to when Ashworth and Staveley were at the club. That has been taken on by Mitchell. That has been taken on by Darren Eales. And Eddie Howe keeps talking about the fact that he is, cocooned, as he says there, in his work on the training pitch. And that is maybe him just saying, look, if the club don't want me to be really, really involved with transfers or really, really involved with negotiations, then that's fine. But they also can't expect me to take the blame when those negotiations don't go right. Is he maybe putting a little bit of a shield around himself so that people can't blame the fact that Newcastle United didn't go out and sign Mark Gahey on Eddie Howe? As I say, he keeps mentioning that. There was another part of the interview where he actually came out and said it's really important that Paul Mitchell came out and spoke about the financial situation. And again, he said, I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not a figures guy. I'm a football man. I can't be, communicating about all these areas of the club that I don't have too much impact in. But then on the other hand, there was, again, to completely go the other way, even though there was that praise for Mitchell, there was also, I've had no contact from Paul, but I don't think that's unusual. We've got different jobs to do. And again, I'm focusing on the football and the team. So clearly, there is still a lot of unanswered questions at Newcastle United. Clearly, Paul Mitchell and the club and Eddie Howe have all seen to, come out and they wanted to draw a line under it. They wanted to offer this big clarification about what unfolded in the summer and what they got wrong and what they're going to do to go forward. But you still can't shake the feeling that something just isn't right. And look, I don't want to be overly negative here. I am, going to go out and make a prediction that may not come true, and I hope it doesn't come true. But I just wonder whether we are going to get to the stage with this new look setup at the club where we get 3, 6, 9, 12 months down the line and either Paul Mitchell or Eddie Howe leave the club for whatever reason, because whatever's happened, and we just look back at this period of time as the beginning of the end for one of them, for whoever goes. We're going to look back at Germany and say Eddie Howe made it clear in the summer that he had big reservations about this new setup at Newcastle. You had Paul Mitchell coming out in his big interview with the press last week and saying, look, yes, Eddie Howe, get on, we speak, but also X needs fix, Y needs fix, Z needs fix. I'm coming in here and I'm playing a role in a structure that might not be fit for purpose. Are we going to look back at this period in time 12 months down the line, if we get our crystal balls out, and think this is where it all started to go wrong? I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong. And again, that is just me making a prediction and maybe playing a little bit of devil's advocate, because as I say, Newcastle have started the season well, despite playing pretty poorly. But there was one real, just to finish, there was one real bone of contention in the press conference, and it was the moment that Eddie Howe really split from Paul Mitchell in terms of what he said. I must admit, when we saw and spoke to Paul Mitchell last week, and we delved through the mountains and the mountains of quotes, the thousands of words that he'd given us over that 90-minute period, this really wasn't something that jumped out at me as, that's the standout line, that's the message to take. But I think as the days have passed and people have been able to sort of digest what Paul Mitchell was saying, one thing that's really stood out is him saying that the setup and the structure and the process that he's walked into at Newcastle United might not be fit for purpose. Now, I think what he means by that is, in the modern game, clubs need a sporting director who is going to be across everything, which Dan Ashworth was to an extent. And Eddie Howe, maybe needs to just focus on the training ground, which he keeps stressing that he is. Now, Eddie Howe today was asked about that question, and Eddie Howe gave quite a robust and quite an emotive response. And he said, just asked about Mitchell's quote on the structure and not being fit for purpose. He said, "I'm very, very proud of every single player that we signed in that period. It's very easy to look back at any transfer window and make a judgment on the players you've signed 3 years down the line. But you have to go back to the situation when we were in those moments, in the relegation zone, trying to recruit players. You're also recruiting not just for the short term, but for the long term. And when you look back, that work was good. Our objective was to stay in the league. So I'm not going to critique every signing, but I'm very, very proud of the body of work that we did and the players we now have from the legacy of those transfer windows." So I think it's about, when you're in that moment and the decisions you made, I think everyone can hold their heads up very high. I don't want to make it about the old structure and the new structure, but obviously those signings played a huge part, and I took ownership of all those signings. Clearly, that is not a man who thinks that the previous structure, the Paul Mitchell era, wasn't fit for purpose. Now, what Paul Mitchell means by that, is he talking about, players like Chris Wood coming into the club for big money, maybe not being able to sell them for as much? Is he talking about maybe some of the signings that Dan Ashworth pushed for, the likes of Grant Kowal, that didn't work out at the club? Is he just talking about the fact that Newcastle found themselves in such a PSR mess back in June that they really shouldn't have left themselves short because the structure wasn't right? We won't know really, probably until we speak to Paul Mitchell again. But that was a real clear split from Eddie Howe, that he doesn't agree with Paul Mitchell there. So it's clearly, just off that one answer alone, there's clear that they're still maybe not on the right page. And I just think, as I've stressed, in the last 13, 14 minutes here, and I will continue to stress, and I've wrote about this in the week, it just does feel like, we are a little bit uncertain about how that relationship is working behind the scenes. Now, just to completely flip it and to try and be positive to end this episode, I do want to say the transfer window has closed. Newcastle United have moved on from what happened in the summer, as disappointing as it was. They're now fully focused. Eddie Howe's got a good group of players there. They're all getting fit. They're not playing well, but they're getting results. They've got key men back from injury. And as I touched on, they've had a fantastic international break in terms of the likes of Sandro Tonali, Anthony Gordon, Bruno, Lewis Hall. All these players having fantastic time away with their country. Let's look to the future. There's every chance now that Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell grow their relationship. They get to know each other. They start formulating plans a little bit further down the road for January. They make one or two really good signings in January. They're in a good position in the Premier League. And actually, we look back at 12 months' time, and instead of thinking, was this the beginning of the end? We can say, actually, look, they got over those early hurdles. They started to work really well together. And actually, isn't it brilliant that they've overcome those early teething problems that I think we're still seeing now? That is obviously the ideal situation. But I just think now, look, we're in mid-September. We've still got 3-4 months until the January window. Hopefully we're sat here in a couple of months' time and Newcastle United in a completely different position. My only sort of worry, and the reason that we've done this episode today and why it's the main talking point after we spoke to Eddie Howe this morning, is after such a tricky summer, we needed some clarity from the club. We needed some confirmation that actually, look, it looks really bad from the outside because we didn't get Mark Gahey and we didn't strengthen Eddie Howe's side when we needed to. We sold two really exciting prospective talents. We needed that clarification. Paul Mitchell tried to give it. Eddie Howe, I think today, will have tried to add to what Paul Mitchell said to try and shut it down. And unfortunately, again, because of how much Paul Mitchell actually gave us last week, we're still here thinking, is everything okay? Eddie Howe insists there's not a civil war at Newcastle. You have to hope that is the correct evaluation of it, and we're not going to be sat here in a couple of months' time thinking maybe there was a little bit of upheaval and there was a bit of war and fractions in between the club. But look, looking ahead to Sunday, Wolves at Molineux. History tells us it's going to be a 1-1 draw. It often is at Molineux. Newcastle need to definitely raise the level of performance that they've shown in the last couple of games, and hopefully kick on now and continue to push up the table with a nice unbeaten run. In terms of injuries, no fresh injuries during the international break, which is a big positive. Joe Willock is back in training, albeit light training. He hasn't been with the group yet. The only real sort of negative that we heard on the injury front from Eddie Howe this morning was that Callum Wilson has suffered, not a setback. Eddie Howe was keen to stress, but he has suffered, or he will be out for a little bit longer than Eddie Howe thought or wanted him to be. They envisioned he might be back now in full training, and it looks like he's maybe a few weeks off that, which is a big blow. But William Asula did score on the international break, so that will do his confidence a world of good. And look, Newcastle United need to just try and build on this good international break down at Molineux, because they've got a tricky run of fixtures, a lot of away games coming up in the next month, and they need to get it right on the pitch, they need to get it right off the pitch, and hopefully we will see them do that. Thank you very much for tuning in at this episode. We will be back across the weekend. We'll have Lee Ryder's post-match pods straight from Molineux as soon as the game's finished. We'll also have the Monday show back live in the studio with myself and Andrew Musgrove. Thank you very much for tuning into this episode about Newcastle United and Eddie Howe's press conference. And until then, we'll speak to you very, very soon.